Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we'll take a deep dive into perhaps one of the most influential battles of the Great War in the Western Front, Cambrai. Famed as the first mass use of tanks in history, it started with great promise, but would end with bitter disappointment for the British Army. What happened and why? Well, hi Dan, always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast, and we're recording this in November, almost exactly, in fact we are exactly 107 years on from the Battle of Cambrai, a battle that is still widely remembered, I think, for involving the largest tank force in history up until this point, would only be exceeded in 1918, and a battle that at the time, on one hand, was seen to be a portent to the future, but on the other hand, was one of the most controversial battles in its outcome that the British Army would ever fight. And I think it's a fascinating topic for discussion.
Yes, hi Spence, and a very good point. I actually hadn't noticed the date until you just mentioned it, so it's quite fitting that we get a chance to cover this story. And I agree. Really, for me, it's about two halves, I think. One in showcasing perhaps a new idea of potential, and the second in having those same old problems again and again, which makes it actually endlessly fascinating because there is this kind of clash of cultures, and it allows us to really unpick what is actually a very influential battle, at least as far as I see it. There's a number of things, but maybe to start off, I guess we need to go back in time a couple of months and really look at the story of the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, because of course Passchendaele has left a really bitter taste in British mouths towards the end of 1917, which has been a fairly bitter tasting year in general. And really I suppose there's a hope, there's a desire for something that's a bit more palatable to end the year on.
This is really true, and we have to remember too the wider context beyond the Western Front. 1917 has been described by myself, quoting Chief of the Imperial General Staff William Robertson, as the darkest year of the war from a British perspective. Besieged under seas by U-boats, heavy German bombing campaign with the Gotha bomber raids, the French army paralysed by indiscipline that bordered on mutiny, the Russians tumbling out of the war and tumbling into Bolshevism, the Italians crushingly defeated at the Battle of Caporetto, and the Americans still at least 6 months away from major deployment, more realistically 9 or even 12 months away. And amidst all this, you have Third Ypres, which starts with possibly exaggerated hopes from Douglas Haig. He thinks he's going to capture the ridges, not merely clear Ypres, but break all the way to the Channel ports. And really by late October, it's quite clear that's not going to be achieved. It's become bogged down. The weather has turned against the battle. Progress is very, very slow. Casualties are mounting. It's not going to work. And yet, there's still a need to try and end the year with striking some sort of blow against the Germans, because otherwise the Germans appear to be triumphant more or less everywhere. As the battles I've already mentioned, they closed down the Eastern Front. Is there somewhere that the British, possibly with French assistance, although that doesn't really translate to Cambrai, is there somewhere the British can strike a blow to end the year with some hint of victory, to try and take away some of the initiative from the Germans? Well, it's not going to be at Ypres, but eyes look along other parts of the Western Front, and what the army's really looking for is there a quiet sector where there's an opportunity to do something? And the need to do this is quite pressing at the end of 1917. That there's a fear that the year has gone so badly that the Germans might just be able to get some sort of political deal out of this and end the war victorious. Not victorious in terms of occupying all the territory they hold, but certainly coming out of the war better than they'd started. And so something has to be done, Dan.
Yeah, and the question is where? And really, that's been a big question throughout the entire Great War. But you have to remember, really, by 1917, with the French problems that they've really encountered from April onwards, you're going to start to see actually the Brits taking on more of the geographical weight bearing, if you like, of the Western Front. They're going to start taking over larger sectors of the Western Front. In fact, it's going to be a problem just 2 or 3 months later when the German spring offensive comes. But the Brits have taken on larger boundaries, and it means that they've got a little more area to explore It also means, if you consider it as well, that with the German retreat to the Hindenburg Line in February 1917, that line has cut back into different areas, some of which have been largely untouched by warfare. And this is really what the Brits are looking for at this point, because they've come up with a new idea. And that new idea is to use a new weapon of war that, of course, we're going to cover in great detail. But in order to do that, you need decent ground. Now, decent ground doesn't always mean weak defenses. In fact, quite often it means the opposite. It means that the area is perhaps so strongly defended that it's not really been ripe for a large scale attack up until this point. But you need good, firm ground that hasn't been churned up by relentless bombardments over months or even years in some cases. And actually, eyes turn to the area around Cambrai.
They do. And Cambrai is a quiet sector. And it's almost the exact opposite of Ypres. It's been quiet really for a long time. The Germans have constructed very dense defenses here. And interestingly, so too have the British. Because it's such a quiet sector, there's not a lot to do. So both sides have really built up their defenses here. And in fact, the Germans used the Cambrai sector as a rest area for badly damaged and battle-shot divisions. It's even described by one German as the sanitarium of the West, because when you are going to send a division that's been mauled somewhere for a bit of relaxation, so to speak, you send them to Cambrai. In fact, it's so quiet in the Cambrai sector, an official order gets put out in 1917, not that long before the battle here, on the British side, warning soldiers to stop shooting at game birds. This area is quite wooded, as we'll discuss later. There's a lot of game, pheasants and so on, wandering around here, and soldiers can't resist taking pot shots at them. And if you manage to bag one, then that's a nice bit of supper for you. But this gives you the impression, listeners, there's more British soldiers shooting at game birds and potentially injuring each other in the process than there is German incoming fire. That's how quiet this sector is. In fact, Germans are observed just walking around openly on their parapets, looking out, smoking on their parapets. It is probably, in 1917, the quietest single sector that the British Army occupies. And perversely, that means it's the perfect sector to attack in, because the Germans are going to be at a low state of readiness. British logistics and British organization on this sector is quite well built up. And unlike other sectors such as the Somme and Ypres and so on, which have been massively torn up by battles and advances and constant shell fire, the ground here is largely untouched. You've even got pretty dense woodland, which will become a problem later in the battle, still standing. And compare and contrast the fate of the woodland around Ypres and on the Somme, which has just been reduced to tree stumps. In a way, this is perfect country for an attack to take the enemy by surprise, and it's especially good for trying to use something new, and that's going to be the tanks.
Yeah, and tanks, of course, are really the story of Cambrai in terms of the larger battle. And there's another word that you used just there, Spence, which I think can go hand in hand with this, and that's the idea of surprise. Because if we go back to 1916, 1915, before that, we need to bear in mind that that old foe of barbed wire is really going to be dominating the battle space. The main reason being is simply stopping infantry moving forwards. In order to break barbed wire, you have to fire a preparatory bombardment. There's no way around it. You absolutely have to do it. In order to do that, you need to fire a lot of guns in the same place for a very long time, and surprise is absolutely out the window. It means that the enemy's got time to react, build up, prepare their defenses, so on and so forth. That same old story. We've heard it once or twice before now. But with tanks, you now have a new opportunity. There's a very strong belief, and it turns out to be a fairly accurate one actually, that the tank not only is a mobile pillbox that can support infantry going forwards, it can also be used as a breakthrough weapon. It can be used to crush and clear large-scale barbed wire. It can rip open defenses, and effectively, it does away, or potentially does away, with the need for an extensive preliminary bombardment. And that, Spence, is a recipe potentially for success.
It is. And it's a type of recipe that's only possible at this period of the war, when you have large numbers of tanks and you have the Royal Artillery probably reaching the pinnacle of its efficiency in terms of its ability to deliver accurate fire, carefully planned scientific bombardments, and also using the 106 Graze fuse, which can vaporize barbed wire rather than having to burst endless rounds of shrapnel above barbed wire belts instead. And what I find really fascinating about the Battle of Cambrai, and something of a counterpoint, I think, to the idea that the British Army was lions led by donkeys, that there wasn't innovation, that people were wedded to old-fashioned ideas, is that the core plan for the Battle of Cambrai is produced by two relatively junior officers. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Tudor, who is from the Royal Artillery. He's the Royal Artillery commander with, I believe, 9th Division, although I stand to be correct on that, who has been thinking for some time in the summer of 1917 about how best to use the Royal Artillery's new scientific talents. And what Tudor wants to do is launch what would now be called an unregistered bombardment. You don't fire any ranging shots. Instead, your bombardment targets, your lanes, and so forth are all worked out from the map in advance. And you can only do this if you have very good maps. And we discussed mapping a few episodes ago. And you have a real understanding of the flight of your shell so you can ensure accuracy. And Tudor proposes an attack that's going to take advantage, for the first time really since 1915, of a completely unregistered surprise bombardment with about 1,000 guns will just open up on the German line. He submits this plan. At the same time, Major John Fuller, who might be better known to listeners as Major JFC Fuller, who is the Chief of Staff of the Tank Corps, he's drawing up plans about, well, how can we use the growing strength of the Tank Corps to achieve surprise? The tanks have had little success or little opportunity for success at Third Ypres. The terrain doesn't suit them. The weather conditions are appalling. And so the Tank Corps is growing in strength, but it's sitting idle. And Fuller, who is an erratic man, but equally a man with a touch of genius about him, draws up this plan for what he calls a tank raid, a surprise attack with no preparatory bombardment where the tanks will burst across into no man's land. They'll destroy the barbed wire. They'll cause some havoc in the German rear areas, and then they'll withdraw. He originally proposes this to take place down on the Somme, but it's rejected because the terrain's so torn up. And instead, he comes up with the idea of Cambrai. And so Tudor and Fuller, completely unaware of each other, are both proposing plans for a surprise attack using either the most advanced artillery or the most advanced tanks. This goes up to Julian Byng, who's the Army Commander, 3rd Army Commander, and he gets both of these and he likes them, and he realizes that if you combine the two, you've got an incredibly promising attack plan, a completely surprise artillery bombardment that will stun the German defenders and knock out their artillery batteries, supported by hundreds of tanks advancing without warning. And what's really interesting about this is, for the first time in a major British battle since Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, it's a plan that is going to achieve, or has a very high chance of achieving, complete surprise. And it's also using the most advanced weapon systems the army has. Its artillery is cutting edge. The tank corps is cutting edge as well. And for the first time, they're going to attack en masse, side by side, using all the technological advantages they have, and in an area where they can achieve surprise. And you can understand, Dan, why this idea, as it moves up the chain of command, it really starts to excite people like Byng and indeed Douglas Haig.
Yeah, you can. And I think for good reason as well. I mean, it's worth pointing out this isn't all one-way traffic. What they will be attacking is very, very well established, heavily defended positions with, I mean, talk about trying to hit barbed wire. No shortage of targets in this area. This is going to be barbed wire plus, plus, plus. So there's a lot that's staked on those two things being successful. One, tanks being able to breach wire and not getting tangled up, which is a real consideration and concern. And secondly, the artillery doing what it's meant to do. And if either of those things don't work, there could be a real disaster on British hands at Cambrai. But for the first time, the idea of actually developing and maintaining surprise until the final moments of the attack is a real possibility. And that excites a lot of people because it quite simply hasn't been seen for a couple of years on the Western Front. Now, I think, Spence, before we get into the real detail, we kind of need to understand a little bit about the battlefield itself and, in a sense, what's intended here. And Cambrai is quite useful in that sense because it's fairly understandable battlefield. And a big part of that is it's bounded on either flank by a waterway. I say waterway, what should be a waterway on either flank? To the left flank or to the northern end of the battlefield, we've got the Canal du Nord, which actually, as it happens, is a big, huge canal system, very impressive if you see it in France today. It's actually dry at the time. It's being constructed when war's declared, but what it does have is very steep banks and effectively forms a kind of hard stop on the left flank of the British line. So on the other side, to the southeastern flank, we have the Saint-Quentin Canal, which is a canal. It's been operating for 100 odd years. Napoleon Bonaparte has famously opened the tunnel that runs through it at Bellicourt. It's going to form the other boundary. So it's about a 6 mile battlefield. The problem is that the Saint-Quentin Canal, as it moves about 3 miles into the German lines, actually takes a hard left and then crosses part of the British battlefield. So it is going to be both a flank and a forward obstacle at some point. Now, the idea is between these two positions, the British are going to advance. They're going to smash through the Hindenburg line position, smash through the Hindenburg support with the help of tanks, bust open those positions, capture a couple of key bridges, including those over the Saint-Quentin Canal, one specifically at a place called Manière. They're going to move on. The troops attacking on the left flank are going to capture a really high and important point known as Bourlon Wood, which really dominates much of the area, including the main dead straight road running to Cambrai itself. And with help, cavalry are then going to be unleashed on the unsuspecting Germans, wreak havoc in their rear areas, encircle and capture the key German supply and logistics hub of Cambrai. Quite simple if you see it on paper, Spence.
Isn't it just as is the way with so many plans? And in fact, if you look at the maps or the pre-maps of Cambrai, it does look quite simple. An advance of maybe 4 to 5 miles will put you in a very strong position. And I'm glad you mentioned Bourlon Wood because Bourlon Wood it's not that big. It's about a mile square. Dense wood, not been damaged. In fact, the only real work that's been done in Bourlon Wood is the Germans have done a bit of logging there for lumber. So the wood is basically untouched, relatively uncommon as part of this period of the war. And it sits atop a small but noticeable ridge. And whoever controls that ridge is going to be in a very strong position. And one of the key things that Douglas Haig puts into the plan as it is moving up the chain of command is he says you've got to get Bourlon Wood as soon as possible, and you need that ridge under control. And in some ways, that's even more important than the cavalry assault towards Cambrai, which is very ambitious, could produce spectacular results. But even if that cavalry assault doesn't pay off, if the British get onto get hold of Bourlon Wood and clear it and get hold of the ridgeline there, they're going to have observation on the Germans for a long way. And in the First World War, observation is crucial. If you have it and your opponent doesn't, you're in a very, very strong position. But these waterways, or water courses, if you prefer, are going to bound the battle. And there's a slightly odd oversight in the British planning for this. We'll get, I think, a little bit more into the planning in just a moment. Planning for this battle is in some ways meticulous. A lot of problems that the British are likely to encounter are dealt with in the planning stage. To just give you a couple of flavors of this, the Royal Artillery, by firing an unregistered barrage, one thing it can't do is it doesn't think it can provide a creeping barrage to go along with the assault. It's worried about relative speeds. It's worried about the tanks getting the ground in front of them chewed up unnecessarily. And there's a lot of thought about this. And then the Royal Artillery says, okay, we'll use what are called lifts. Just hammer one part of the German front, then onto the next, and onto the next, with various communication methods to rearrange it. The tanks have got a problem crossing the deep and wide trenches that the Germans have here. And so they solve this, and we'll get onto this a little bit more, I'm sure, by creating fascines, the bundled twigs, effectively, that you can drop in front of your tank to use as a trench crossing tool. It will fall in front of the trench, and you can drive over it. Very useful. But if there's one gap in all the planning, it's how are you going to get tanks, cavalry, and ultimately even infantry across these canals. These are quite serious barriers. And if there's one blind spot in the planning, there's not enough thought given to this. I should add as well, there aren't really good solutions. You don't have bridging tanks at Cambrai. You have to wait to the Second World War for those. You do have bridging units that can come up, but it's going to be difficult to get those across the battlefield quickly. So these canals are going to be a serious, serious problem as the battle goes on. But the British don't really realize this at the time. And one thing to just sort of add to this is there's so much that's good in the planning of Cambrai that the things that go wrong, I think, tell us a little bit about just how difficult it is to plan a battle. That all this intellectual effort's put into it, get so much right. You only need one or two things that you miss, Then add in the enemy's actions on top of that, and suddenly the battle becomes much, much more complicated.
Yeah, it's the idea of maybe what you sometimes call a single point of failure. If you look at any great disaster in history, quite often what it is, it's five, six, or seven different things going wrong. The sinking of the Titanic had five of the six key aspects not happened, it would have never worked out the way it did. Although occasionally what you do get are those things where if that one specific thing fails, the entire thing comes unstuck. And there are a couple of really high risk moments here. The very first one, first and foremost here, is that old problem, the old menace of barbed wire. If for some reason tanks, if you drive up to some German barbed wire in the Hindenburg line and you realize that either they get clogged up and the wire's too thick and it's going to foul up the tracks, you're now not going to get any gaps through the wire through which the infantry directly following the tanks are going to be able to exploit. If the artillery doesn't do its job, likewise, you're going to fall at the first hurdle and we're not going to see any progress there at all. The same thing you could argue is true of bridging. If you get to a bridge and the bridge is no longer standing, that's a serious problem. Or a bit like in Cambrai, if you start driving over the bridge and you realize your tank is too heavy and it drops the bridge into the thing you're trying to cross, again, major problem. So there are still these major concerns, but it's warfare. There've always been major concerns like this. I think in argument though, there is a real spirit of optimism prior to Cambrai because there are a few new innovations. And I'm going to go back to it. I'm sure we'll come back to it again, Spence. This idea of secrecy is absolutely pivotal. Doesn't mean it's a given because there are many things that could give away your movements, could give away your plans and your strategy, all of that kind of thing. And actually, as we get to it, the logistics of bringing up huge numbers of tanks into a very small area is very difficult to do whilst maintaining secrecy. But, Cambrai, before the battle is launched, is at least showing quite a lot of promise. And it's worth pointing out here, the British are also allocating large numbers of troops because of that. They realize that there is a real possibility here. So we're going to see six infantry divisions, including a couple of very highly regarded ones, including the 51st Highland Division. They're going to be in the attack. 476 tanks, Spence, 378 of which are going to be fighting tanks, mostly Mark IVs. We'll come on to that in a moment. 300 aircraft supporting, and several cavalry divisions waiting to exploit. But of course, it's really at this stage is the tank, and the tank I think is one of those things that really has a lot of the burden of the success of Cambrai placed on it. And by this stage in the war, there've started to be some serious improvements.
There was, and something that I think we're apt to forget is that tanks had only gone into action for the first time just over a year earlier, on the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. This is a completely new weapon system produced during the war. First sees action on the Somme with promising, encouraging results, I think we described in a previous episode. Tanks have seen some action in 1917 at Arras, at Bullecourt, at Messines Ridge, but they haven't seen universal success. The tanks haven't done very well at Bullecourt, for example, and it lead to lasting bitterness between the Australians and the tank corps. And what we have to bear in mind is you have this very, very new weapon system that has grown exponentially. At the Flers-Cours-Soleil in September 1916, maybe 21 tanks actually get into action out of 32 that go off the start line. As you say, Dan, at Cambrai, you've got close to 400 tanks ready to roll into action. Fighting tanks, not to mention a variety of support tanks that are going to be following up and coming with them. And this is just an incredible expansion of the fighting arm. And to break down those numbers a bit further, 476 total tanks are going to go into the Battle of Cambrai. 378 of those are fighting tanks. 54 are supply tanks and what are called gun carriers. They literally will carry guns, support guns into action. 32 are wire pullers. These are special tanks that have grappling hooks on their tail, and they will work to tear apart barbed wire and make gaps that larger forces can go through. There are actually 2 bridging tanks, and this goes against what I just said, but these bridging tanks they're not in the same style as the Second World War. These are not, in fact, they are an outgrowth of trench bridges rather than waterway bridges. And so they're not going to be able to repair a bridge over a canal with a great deal of ease. There's wireless tanks that are designed for communication, and there's 9 of those They have some problems because you can't operate a wireless set within a tank. You actually have to take the set out and then use it, which is obviously a little bit dangerous, but it's still an improvement. And there's also a telephone tank. Its sole purpose is to lay out telephone wire to connect various points of the front line back to headquarters. So we've gone from this very small scale attack a year earlier, or just over a year earlier, where nobody really knew what they were doing, to now you have a genuine armored fighting force. And the Tank Corps is a fascinating organization in itself because it recruits largely through volunteers. When the Tank Corps is expanding, adverts are placed or sent out to the battalions asking for volunteers. And the Tank Corps has a pretty long list of demands. It wants people who can handle heavy weapons, because tanks have got pretty big guns. It wants engineers, people who are used to motor driving, engineering repairs. It wants daredevils as well because it's a daring work. What it actually gets is pretty much anybody it can lay its hands on. And I have to read a famous quote out here. This is from JFC Fuller himself, reflecting on what the Tank Corps was like in 1917. And he remembered, frankly, I had never seen such a band of brigands in my life. The reason became apparent directly I was told that recruitment had been open to the whole army in France, for this naturally meant that every disgruntled man or impossible soldier had sought an escape from his surroundings by applying to join the heavy branch. There were cavalrymen, infantrymen and gunners, army service corps men, sappers, and actually a sailor, although how he had found his way here I cannot say. There were men in trousers, men in puttees, men in trench boots, and men in kilts. There was every type of cap badge and deficiency in cap badges. The men looked exactly what they were, the down and outs of bawling sergeants and unfriendly corporals. And the Tank Corps had, in some ways, as Fuller explains, become a bit of a dumping ground to send off your difficult privates. Oh, you go and join the Tank Corps, you'll do well there. What's amazing then is from this, in some ways, unpromising material, not all of the Tank Corps were dissolute young men. Absolutely not. There were some very brave and determined and professional officers in there too, and men for that matter. But what's fascinating about the Tank Corps is how it had formed a real esprit de corps. And I think the very fact that you're fighting in a tank, there'll be 8 men in your Mark IV or Mark I tank. You live in close proximity to each other. And once you roll into battle, 8 men in the tank, you need each man to do his job properly. Otherwise, your tank's going to be knocked out or it's not going to achieve success. And I think the bonds of loyalty in the Tank Corps are very impressive as a result. And it has to be said that under the Tank Corps commander, Hugh Ells, and his chief of staff, JFC Fuller, the Tank Corps really put through its paces in 1917 and onwards. And the quality of training, the quality of experience as well, because although these men aren't seeing that much action, they are constantly training in their tanks. They're learning a lot about how it handles, a lot of the drawbacks in the tank as well. I think that the Tank Corps is reaching a pinnacle of efficiency actually on the eve of Cambrai. And it's interesting the interactions between the cavalry, the tanks, and the infantry. The cavalry and the infantry tend to look down on the tanks. They see tank crewmen lying around resting a lot of the time. They don't seem to be doing a lot of work. Tank crews are spared a lot of labor duties, which the infantry have to do, much to the infantry's displeasure. And the Tank Corps has a swagger as well by 1917. If you're a tank man, you're proud to be a tank man. You start to forget your old regiment. And yet, Dan, actually fighting in a tank, a British World War I tank, has to be one of the most grueling and difficult battle environments you could find in the First World War.
Well, that's the thing. And I know we've covered this before in our episode on tanks, but it's worth dwelling on even just for a moment now, because the experience, as you say, of fighting in a tank was extremely difficult. Not only are you an absolute bullet magnet for anything that the enemy can fire at you, be it small arms, artillery, anything of that kind, even mortars dropped on tanks, but also the experience of being inside a tank is incredibly unhealthy. These things with a large, powerful for the time engine, unventilated, inside a metal box, get extremely hot. We're talking 50 degrees centigrade inside a tank. That's very, very difficult to operate in at the best of times, let alone being shot at. And in addition to that, of course, this open unventilated engine is pouring out carbon monoxide, which is making the guys in the tank have, one, a banging headache, but secondly, quite literally slowly poisoning them. So tank crews routinely will go into action with doors open, just to ventilate until the very last moment when they'll shut their hatches and try and button up in that sense. But for as long as possible, ventilate the tank. It's a dangerous environment, lots of sharp edges. If you fall in a trench in a tank with a load of sharp edges in it, you're going to seriously injure yourself. A lot of broken bones. There's ammunition rolling around inside tanks. They're incredibly slow as well, which means you're going to be in action for a long period of time. And interestingly, Spence, in a sense, by listening and reading accounts about tanks, it seems to be, and it almost sounds counterproductive. It's not necessarily, or counterintuitive, I should say. It's not necessarily when men are in the tanks that they tend to fall ill. It's actually rather when they get out of them after a prolonged period of action and finally get some fresh air. Men are quite often sick and have to lie down and literally rest for a period of time. And so I wonder if sometimes when we see the infantry looking at a tankman lying around, prostrate on the ground, it's maybe not that he's just done 10 miles in a tank and is still suffering the effects of it.
Completely right. The carbon monoxide poisoning for tank crews is a severe problem. And carbon monoxide poisoning is understood a little in the context of the First World War, but it's not understood to the level we have it to this day. What is observed is tank crews become sickened and ill. Effectively, they will start to lose consciousness after a certain time. They're not capable of fighting from their machines anymore. And by the time of Cambrai, the tank corps has worked out that a tank that is in action and motion is crewed for 8 hours continuously. A crew then needs 48 hours to recover. And listeners, that gives you some idea of just how badly these men are being carbon monoxide poisoned, that you need 2 days, and they are basically incapable in those 2 days. They will improve as time goes on, but they're nauseous, they're exhausted, they're lightheaded, they just want to lie down and sleep, difficult to eat in this time. And the tank corps knows this, that after 8 hours of continuous work in the tank, you are going to be completely done up. And that's before you've even got into the problems of being involved in action, because fighting in a tank, as well as being carbon monoxide dense, extremely hot interior temperatures in a tank, usually about 50 degrees Celsius, 125 degrees Fahrenheit, so baking hot. It's incredibly noisy. The engine is of course deafening. The guns are deafening, and in fact, the guns on the male version of the tank are 57 millimeter or 6-pounder guns, so pretty formidable a piece of firepower. There's accounts of gunners in these tanks in action. They have to actually hold the gun to make sure that they know it's fired, because it's so loud in there, they can't actually be completely sure if a gun is fired unless they actually feel the vibration through their hands. That's how loud it is. And communications within the tank, either you have to yell into somebody's ear at the very top of your voice, or in some cases you have to punch people on the shoulder and just indicate through hand signals. And the final thing I'll say is, listeners in Britain or who visit Britain, if you ever get the chance, do go to Bovington Tank Museum, where you can climb into replica World War One tanks. And I'm not the tallest man in the world. I'm not the biggest man in the world. I find it difficult to get into those tanks. What it was like to cram 8 people into one of those tanks, I can scarcely imagine, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really quite something else. And you mentioned quite rightly, I think, about this idea of a bond that grows up between these men, and you can understand it's almost like an entire little family unit, in one of these boxes, all sharing the same risk, of course. And quite often, if they're going to fall, they might all fall in the same moment because a tank getting hit directly by an artillery round is gonna do some serious devastation. In fact, I just want to mention one specific tank whilst we're here because it's perhaps the most famous tank of the Battle of Cambrai. It's part of D Battalion. We should mention here all tanks from the same battalion, depending on whether it's A, B, C, D, etc., are all going to start with their tank name using that same letter. So D51 in this case, I think it's 12 section of 12 company of the of D Battalion of the Tank Corps. D51 is known as Deborah. Deborah's a female tank, and she's going to go into action on the opening day of the Battle of Cambrai, in towards really the key part of the German strong point on the Cambrai front. It's the town of Flequier, and her job is going to be to punch through the 3 objective line. There are 3 objective lines for Cambrai: the blue line, which is effectively the Hindenburg front line; the brown line, which is the Hindenburg support, which includes the objective of Flequier; and eventually the red line, which is much further on towards Bourlon-Wood. Her job is going to be to go into action, cross over the first trenches, which hopefully have been captured, and then push on and capture Flequier. Now, another thing to mention here is, D-51 Deborah, she's got a crew of 8. She's commanded by a young man by the name of Frank Heap, who has also come in from an infantry unit. He started his career, I think, as a dispatch rider and has later on volunteered for the tanks, as so many did. His crew of 8 are going to be going into action, and we'll come back to their story, no doubt. But they're, I think, symptomatic of one of those particular units. And what's interesting as well, Spence, is the tactics they're going to employ on that day, because we're not seeing what we did at Fleur Courcelette here, where we get individual tanks go and do your best, see what can be done. In fact, we're going to start seeing tanks fighting in sections now. In fact, they're going to be sections of 3 here at Cambrai. And they've even got their dedicated ways of crossing trenches. Everybody's got their own little job to do. And it's quite an interesting concept when you think about it.
It is, and it shows how the tanks have gone from being a weapon that is just a technological marvel in many ways, the most sophisticated land fighting vehicle in the world by a margin, that people are commanders, I think, expect to do very well because it is technologically advanced. It has its problems, but by the time of Cambrai, you have begun to put appropriate tactics to this machine. And if there's one thing that JFC Fuller, who is the chief of staff who does a lot of planning and training for this, he's absolutely insistent of, is he wants this battle to be, in his words, a clockwork battle. He recognizes that because tanks aren't very fast, going over rough terrain, a tank goes at about 25 yards a minute. We can walk faster than that quite easily. So you need to make sure your timing's correct. He describes it as he wants it to be a clockwork battle. He wants this to be organized. He wants this to be planned. And as you say, Dan, means that tanks are going to work in a very specific way. You'll have advanced guard tanks who are going to go over in the almost a sort of wedge formation. It's not quite that, but that's a good way to visualize it, listeners. Your advanced guard tanks will pierce the wire. They will cross the trenches. They'll drop their fascines. They are these huge bundles of twigs straight into the trench and drive over them. And then they'll turn left and right and take the German position under the guns in their side sponsons. Then what's called the battle tanks will roll over those fascines that have already been dropped. They'll push on. They'll use their fascines to cross the next trench, and so on and so forth, until eventually the German trench system is completely overwhelmed. Infantry, of course, following behind them. And compared to the preparations at Fleurs, there's a lot more training between tanks and infantry coming up to Cambrai. And I think the infantry is more impressed with tanks now. There's a lot of them. They can see things. They can see what the tanks are doing. Perhaps they're getting a bit of a feel from it. Not every division perhaps trains as well with its tanks as it could do, and perhaps we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But nevertheless, the training, preparation, tactics, and planning to use tanks are light years away from the use of tanks in September 1916. It has real hints of modern war here, and combined with this completely unexpected, unprepared, unregistered artillery bombardment, and another element we haven't mentioned, raw flying corps aircraft carrying out low-level strafing runs on the German trenches and deep strikes behind the German lines that are specifically designed to try and knock out the German Air Force, or at least seriously disrupt it on its own airfields. You've got the beginnings of what we would see as a 21st century battle.
Very intriguing to consider it that way. But I think I agree with you. There really are some moments here. You think about it, we're going to have tanks, infantry, artillery, cavalry, even going into action at this battle. So there's a kind of twinkle of what we're going to see in 1918. But before that happens, of course, you've got to get there. The tanks have got to get there. And these tanks have been dispersed all up and down the Western Front, certainly in the British sector, waiting really for their opportunity. And now what's got to happen in secrecy, mind you, which is the big problem, is you've got to converge 476 tanks onto a 5 mile front, bring them up very close to the front line, and somehow hide them so that the enemy don't see it and you don't give the entire game away even before you start. That's a really difficult thing to do. In fact, it's a logistical nightmare, the size of which the British Army really hasn't dealt with for a very long time. It's not like Arras in 1917 where you can hide a couple of thousand guys in a tunnel. You just quite simply can't do that. Fortunately, and perhaps this is even part of the planning here, the fact that this ground hasn't really been torn up, including the rear areas, does offer some opportunities, and that's to be found particularly in woods. more specifically on the Cambrai battlefield, in and around Havrincourt Wood, which is still largely standing, still got some green stuff knocking about, and you can hide. And in fact, the British do assemble more than 100 tanks just prior to the offensive starting, and it's within about 3,000 yards of the British front line. So actually, you can do this. But the process of bringing those tanks up to the front line in the first place is extremely difficult. It needs multiple flat cars. It needs entire rail systems. And your tanks are not on the rail system, you've got to take them off and you've got to drive them into a nearby wood and hide them. Because, of course, the Germans during this whole time, Spence, they're not standing still.
No, they're not. And monumental efforts are made to ensure secrecy here. And in this respect, the British have some advantages. One, German attention is still very much fixed on Third Ypres. Although the battle is coming to its bitter, mud-stricken end by the start of November, it's still going to go on. And in fact, the last major attack at Third Ypres is going to be a night attack at the start of December. So that's really where the bulk of German assets are deployed. And it's where the Germans are still looking. There's also been a French attack a little bit earlier down on the River Aisne, which has not exactly alarmed the Germans, but it shows that the French are recovering. Perhaps they might do something. So the German eyes are looking in a different direction. The other aspect is the weather is not very good. The same rainfall that is making Ypres an absolute misery is sweeping down south across France, and it's raining across the Cambrai front, which means that German air reconnaissance is greatly hampered. The weather's not good enough for air reconnaissance. And then on top of that, you have the huge effort, which I'm glad you brought up Arras, because obviously surprise is achieved to an extent at Arras as well, but you've got advantages there. The cave system is hugely advantageous. At Cambrai, you don't have that. What you do have is that sort of sense of relaxation that I think descends on quiet sectors, and confidence too, perhaps overconfidence for the Germans, because they are in very strong positions. They are in a Hindenburg line position, effectively, very deep trenches, very well constructed. So that adds to it. But otherwise, all kinds of methods are used to disguise the approach of the tanks, the assemblage of the tanks. Low-flying aircraft fly up and down to disguise tank engine noises. Tanks are hidden in buildings with camouflage netting over the top of them. Tanks are even dug into small pits so that they're a bit lower down, and again covered with camouflage nets, in some cases to try and make it look like gun positions rather than actual tank positions. And the Royal Artillery too has to sneak in its guns. The Royal Artillery deploy over 1,000 guns here. It has to slowly and subtly move them into position as well. And what's particularly tense is at any moment this plan might be rumbled. The fact that it's not is, one hand, it's a little bit the Germans are distracted, but on the other hand, it's probably the most successful attempt to create operational secrecy since the Battle of Arras. And as you said, Dan, the situation there was a little bit easier. It favoured, I think, the British there. So you've got all the elements in place. You have a massed armoured force. You have your artillery secretly in place. You have your Royal Flying Corps ready to go. You've had the tanks training. All that's left, Dan, is to actually begin the attack.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because we're 45 minutes into this episode. We need to at least have a shot fired. This is definitely going to be a two-parter, I think, Spence. It's such a great subject.
Yes.
So, yeah, absolutely. So by the 19th of November, 1917, those leading tanks, the first and second wave, have made their way up predominantly into Havrincourt Wood, but also into areas to the south as well. And they're going to be getting ready once night falls. They're actually going to make about a 9-mile journey up the night before, eventually get into Havrincourt Wood, or 2 nights before, I should say. Those troops are going to have a rest. During the following day, they're going to load up with their ammunition. They're going to fill up with their oil and their grease and their petrol, all of those kind of things that are needed. They're eventually going to get into their tanks late in the evening, each with their objectives and their lines marked out, and they're going to rumble up to the front line, as you say, under cover of aircraft swooping low over German heads, trying to keep them distracted and cover that distinctive noise of hundreds of tank tracks squealing up the road. At the same time as the infantry is going to move up, and it's going to be a fresh division in the Flequier sector. 51st Division are going to move up, and they're going to be getting ready to move off with their allocated tanks early the following morning. It's there's a really powerful account. I don't have it to hand, Spence, actually, but it's one that sticks in my mind, of a German soldier actually who's writing home just at the very moment that the Battle of Cambrai is going to open, and he talks about writing. I think he's written the letter, as far as I'm aware, still survives, and it's a guy who says he's written 2 really nice, neat pages And then all of a sudden, as he gets halfway down the third page, the handwriting just goes completely off the page because he's just been directly under this enormous hurricane bombardment that smashes and really announces the start of the battle, because it's an extraordinary bombardment and it signals the start of the fight to come.
It is an extraordinary bombardment, and even veterans who've fought at the Somme, who fought at Arras, even they're stunned by the violence of this because it starts so suddenly. And although the bombardments of the earlier war were prolonged, ghastly, I'm sure, to be underneath them, people became almost philosophical about the bombardments. They went on day after day after day. This is different because every gun starts with this tremendous crash of fire. And I'd like to read out a quote from a private Billy Kirkby of the West Yorkshires down in 62nd Division. He remembered this about the opening of the fire at 6:20 a.m. on the 20th of November. He remembered, "Suddenly, the silence of the coming dawn was shattered by such an earthquake and fire as surely was never heard before by men. Though the ground shook with the thunder of our massed guns, it was the breathtaking circle of multicolored flames, rising like millions of gigantic fireworks, which produced a sight so breathtaking, so altogether awe-inspiring, as to root us to the ground, unable to take our eyes away from the beauty of man's explosive power, appearing like some ethereal glory, rather than the concentrated, hellish force which would tear men apart, leaving them little more than shapeless, shattered flesh and blood." And for Kirkby, a veteran or been in the army for several years at this point, for him to be so stunned by this bombardment, I think speaks to just the violence of it, and that it begins completely without warning. There is no registration shot, descends upon the German front line with absolutely crushing force. And listeners, bear in mind, this has been a backwater sector, a quiet sector for years and years and years. And suddenly it's been blown apart without any warning, and surprise is absolutely complete.
Couldn't agree more. Surprise is a really big deal. And actually, it's aided by a couple of things as well. One, really, of a British design, and another one, which is just the roll of a dice. Because surprise, ideally, doesn't want to just last until that first gun is fired, but it wants to last until your troops are on the enemy line. And one of the reasons that it does so is that there's actually a smoke screen delivered, a very effective one, on the German gun batteries and onto those positions in and around the Brown line, around Flequier village. It effectively blinds the Germans. So whilst they're getting hit by something very heavy, and clearly something is going on, actually understanding what that something is going to take some time. And by the time that happens, the leading tanks are already going to be on the Hindenburg line. It's also followed and supported by that same thing that we've mentioned many times before, that's very, very important warfare. It's the stroke of luck of having some mist descend. In November in the Cambrai front, it's a very misty morning. It actually screens a number of those tanks again until they rumble up to the Hindenburg line. And that's the first moment there, Spence, where we get this first question that needs to be answered. Are these tanks, once they hit this wire, are they going to be able to do the job that we think they are? Are they going to breach the wire? Are they going to allow the following infantry to get in and capture what is effectively a very, very tough nut to crack in the Hindenburg line? And it's not a given. You know, you can take tanks back behind the lines in British sectors and you can run them over barbed wire. You can do various things like that. But the Hindenburg line is a very different beast to normal barbed wire. In this sector, we've got maybe 3 different belts of barbed wire. And when we say belts, I mean 50 yards thick, each of them. That could be 150 yards of barbed wire strung out in various different patterns. Some of it's been knocked about. It's got stakes in the ground. Later on, we're going to find that things have been sewn into the ground as well as anti-tank measures, things like trench mortars, even British toffee apples. We're going to see things like this. So actually, until those first tanks rumble into there and realize that they're actually able to crush that wire, it's still a bit of an unknown. But incredibly, and fortunately for those lads following behind, that's exactly what they managed to do.
They do, and I have to read out a quote here from Captain Mark Dillon of B Battalion of the Tank Corps, and he remembered after this, just echoing exactly what you've said, Dan. He remembered, "I had never seen such a depth of barbed wire. I suppose it was 10 yards deep and about 4 feet high, so dense that you could not poke a broom handle through it. it was quite impossible to any man or beast, and of course would never be destroyed by artillery fire in a month of Sundays. But our tanks went through it, and I personally followed their tracks and walked straight through on the track without any trouble, as if it had all been a carpet. And that is the story of the initial attack at Cambrai. The initial advance guard tanks crush the barbed wire, create lanes through it. And the officer there I was quoting, keen-eared listeners, you'll notice he was walking. He was doing that because the follow-up waves often had their tank commanders walk in front of the tanks to steer them into position. Pretty dangerous. You're highly exposed. But what is found by the infantry and indeed the follow-up waves of the tanks is the barbed wire has been absolutely smashed. The tanks have gone across it. And in some ways, this is exactly what the tanks were designed to do in the first place. Machine gun destroyers, barbed wire crushers. They're the ultimate trench-busting fighting machine. And now, en masse, with good supporting artillery, with good supporting infantry, they're doing what they always were meant to do. And they're doing on a battlefield that's well designed for them. Very, very gentle slope in this area. Good tank country. The ground's pretty hard and pretty firm, not torn up. And really, in terms of assaulting the German trench lines, the tanks are pretty irresistible in these opening hours.
Yeah, and they quite simply, it's no great surprise in a sense. They just do what they're meant to do. Ironically, it's about the first time it's happened en masse. It's not plain sailing, as we'll find out, of course, but enough tanks get into enough key positions. Female tanks are able to machine gun down traverses of trenches. Male tanks are able to knock out more distant objectives with their 6-pounder guns. And infantry that now have the confidence that those tanks are going to do what they're meant to do, following hot on their heels. And as soon as they get through that trench, infantry jumping in left and right, clearing out trench lines. It really is. You mentioned clockwork there. It's fantastic. The first phase of the opening moments of the Battle of Cambrai, supported, of course, by that mist and the German field artillery batteries been shrouded by smoke, makes it an incredible success. You could almost look at it and say, well, why didn't somebody say, well, why haven't we tried this before? Well, we've answered that question. It's not really been available before, but now it is. And now it seems to be doing the job. But it's not all plain sailing. Some of the old demons, even at this stage in the fight, some of the old demons, the mechanical demons that tanks have had to deal with, are going to start rearing their head.
They are, because although we've painted a very positive picture of the tanks and what they can do, and obviously they've improved a great deal, they're improved in terms of their training and so forth. In terms of their technology, they're not that much more advanced from the old Mark 1s that went into action in September 1916. Most of the tanks, in fact, all of the fighting tanks are Mark 4s, fractionally more advanced than the Mark 1s. They've incorporated some small improvements, but these are still very, very cutting-edge machines with all the problems that you might encounter with them. You still have the effects on the crew that we've described. You still have some of the difficulties inherent with early tanks. Visibility out of the tank is very, very poor. And in the Cambrai assault, it's actually worsened because the tank commander does have a periscope that will come out of the roof of his tank that he can use to observe the battlefield. But the fascines that they're carrying actually block this. And it's not until you've dropped your fascine that you can see again. And to give a sense of just the unreliability of tanks as well, this is before we've even got onto the fact that engines are a little prone to giving out. Their engines are basically underpowered for the size of the machine. Even though the ground is not torn up, it still has its pitfalls, it still has its problems. And this starts to knock out tanks. And just to really emphasize this, the commander-in-chief of or I should say the commander of the tank corps, the previously mentioned Hugh Elles, he actually decides he's going to go into battle in his own tank, leading the tank corps into action at the battle, which is a very brave and daring maneuver. And he goes into H. Hilda, named after one of his favorite aunts. You've got the commander of the entire corps is leading his tanks into battle, flying the tank corps standard from which he's actually come up with the concept of this, out of this tank. He's raring to go with his crew, but his tank breaks down. He ditches. And nothing he can do about this. It's just one of the perils of this. And so even though the tanks are doing what they've always been designed to do, they're having success really from, the opening minutes of the attack. They're also starting to suffer some of the problems they've had. And this is before the Germans have really recovered from this initial bombardment. and are preparing themselves to fight. Because one thing to really get across, listeners, to you about Cambrai is breaching the trench lines at Cambrai is only part of the battle. And in some ways, the most ferocious fighting it comes after those trench lines have been cleared.
Yeah, certainly that's not lost on those guys that are going to be going over the top in the second wave. And by the time that shock and that surprise has worn off, we're going to see a very different battle, and particularly in the days to come. But a key point to make here, at least from the very outset, is those first lines are breached. The Hindenburg front line, the Hindenburg support line, what's effectively the blue line objective, that very breaking into the Hindenburg line. That is achieved, and it's achieved almost across the board. There's great success. A number of small villages are captured. The advance is going to push on through an area on the Flequier front, through an area called the Grand Ravine or the Grand Ravin. And that's going to see the advance now moving up and start to head towards the second objective, which is going to be the brown line. As you say, Spencer, this is where we're going to start to see real issues because, and one of them actually is of the Allies making. This idea of doing everything to the clock, working to clockwork, is useful in some senses because it allows cohesion to be maintained. It allows troops to catch up and reestablish with their tanks, and it allows the battle to be reset and restarted again. It also allows the Germans all of those benefits as well. They get their time and they're able to make decisions and to reinforce areas. And we're going to start to see that reaction. It's really going to, the fulcrum of which is going to be around Flequier itself. There's also something perhaps a little less tasteful from the Allied side here. And bear in mind, as the Brits have been piercing through the Hindenburg line, they're going into a well-established, fairly healthy, fairly prosperous, if you like, part of the German line. And quite often that comes with a little bit of opportunity for some additional pocket money to be found and various different bits of loot to be acquired. And this actually becomes a little bit of an issue in that battle.
It does. And one thing that is, perhaps you can't forgive the soldiers for this, is the opening assault on the trenches is so successful in most places. Yes, there is fighting. A number of German positions hold out. The German army is caught by surprise. It's stunned by the attack, but it's like a boxer who's taken a heavy hit, but is still cleared-eyed. It's going to start punching back very, very quickly. But what's happened here is that the sheer speed and scale and comparative ease with which this very formidable German position has been overrun thrills the soldiers. As you say, Dan, this is a very well-prepared, long-established German area, deep dugouts, bunkers, all kinds of things that is being overrun. And British soldiers get tremendously excited looting the place. And there's almost a sort of bit of capering. People are wearing German helmets. Everyone's trying to seize a Luger pistol off a German officer. People are snatching things out of people's pockets and things like this. There is a sense that we've broken through, we've won, we've won. To quote about a different battle, there's a sense in parts of the battlefield, not all, but in parts of the battle, the troops are acting, they're getting into this dangerous state of relaxation in parts of the battlefield that occurs when troops think a battle has already been won. And there is some disorder. Disorder is perhaps too strong a word, but there is some disruption. Troops as well, there's a lot of Germans get captured, get overrun. Troops are very keen to sort of have a look at them, possibly relieve them of certain items, and then try and bustle them back across no man's land. Really, from the moment you hit the trenches, for all the success you're having there, you're also beginning to lose a little bit of cohesion with every step of the way. Tanks breaking down, infantry being disrupted, German pockets of resistance fighting back very hard. And although the momentum continues, this is one of the perils, I think, of a clockwork battle. If something runs like clockwork, then it has no outside interference at all. It's no internal interference, no friction. But in war, the enemy always has a vote, always has a say. And the German army is, as we've established across this entire podcast, it's a very formidable fighting force. This might well be a quiet German sector. Well, it is. Germans here are caught by surprise. But that doesn't mean that the moment that surprise wears off, they won't fight back very, very hard. And indeed, as the trench lines are cleared and the army starts to move into the open country, that's when the really intense fighting is going to begin. And I'm very conscious, Dan, that we've been going at this for an hour now, and I wonder whether, perhaps as the British might have wished to do at the real battle, whether it might be wise to take a break here and pick up the story in our next episode.
Yeah, I think it's a good shout, Spence. Let's leave the viewers with this vision. So the first line has been broken through. The blue line is captured. There's a slight pause here where you get those tanks brought up. You get new tanks, those second wave tanks that start 30 minutes behind the originals. They're going to work their way up, including D51 Deborah, who's going to come up, get into the front line. She's going to take over now, and she's going to be part of that next wave. They're going to be moving against a slow and gentle rise directly towards the village of Flekia. What they don't know, but they'll very soon find out, is that the Germans have, as you said, recovered. They are now waiting, and we're going to see a duel of artillery against tanks, the likes of which have never been seen on the Western Front before. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. South-southeast, we have the... Oh, I've done it again. What's the other one? What is it?
I've got to get my maps out here.
St. Quentin Canal, Saint-Quentin.
That's it. Yes. There's the outtake.
Yeah. Okay, right.